Welcome to another session of lectures by Lob-EZ. Today we're looking at the Protestant Reformation, continuing our discussion with the Protestant Reformation. So this is chapter 3.2, section A. I'm going to break these up into smaller individual videos. So today we're going to be discussing Henry VIII, his break from Catholicism, and then what the Church of England looked like under his son, Edward VI, his eldest daughter, Mary, and then finishing up with Elizabeth. So when we talk about Henry VIII, we talk about him on the heels of Martin Luther, and while we discussed Martin Luther's religious convictions and his desire to want to reform the Catholic Church as his ultimate reason for breaking with it and establishing Lutheranism, Henry, on the other hand, was doctrinally very conservative. His belief, as far as the practices of the Catholic Church, he didn't have any concerns. And so even though he breaks away from the Catholic Church, ironically, he is given this title, Defender of the Faith, because he defends in writing the seven sacraments against some of the things that Martin Luther said about them. And you may recall Martin Luther talked about only two, baptism and Eucharist, being scripturally supported. So it's kind of interesting that he was given this title. But yeah, the issue with Henry is, who's shown here along with his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, the inability of Catherine to give him a male heir is ultimately what drives him to break with the Catholic Church, and we're going to get into the reasons because he couldn't get a divorce. We'll discuss that because that has a lot to do with Catholic doctrine. But who is Catherine of Aragon? She is the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella from Spain, and she is also the aunt of Emperor Chucky V. And so this is going to be important in just a moment. Okay, so by 1527, after they had been married for some time, they'd only had one child that survived, and that was Mary, and she was a daughter. Okay, and so technically a woman could inherit the throne, but Henry feared that people wouldn't accept her, and that this could cause a crisis of secession. This could cause a group of nobles to sort of compete for the throne, and which could devolve the country into a civil war. And that was something that he hoped to avoid. If you know that his father was the Henry VII, came to power to end another sort of crisis of secession, the War of the Roses, it makes sense. It makes sense that that's something that he wants to avoid. All right. So he has a mistress. This marriage was politically arranged. We'll discuss in just a moment sort of what that's about. But Henry had a mistress, not terribly uncommon for that to occur, but she had become pregnant, which I guess also wasn't the most uncommon thing in the world. However, he was hoping that she would bear him a son, and so the plan is hatched then that if this marriage is to be legitimized and also the child to be legitimized, he's going to need a divorce. And so, I mean, because they have about 9 months or so, this sort of puts things on the front burner for Henry, and he begins to seek the divorce. But the Catholic Church does not acknowledge divorce in any circumstances because it is considered a sacrament. And since that marriage takes place under God, the belief is that their souls are merged, and only death can separate them. But there is a caveat. There is an exemption, or an exception rather, and that's called an annulment. And so we'll discuss that. So Henry relied on his top cardinal within England, Cardinal Wolsey, to go to Pope Clement VII in order to get the marriage annulled. Typically, that wouldn't have been too difficult. However, there were circumstances that prevented this from taking place. First of which is the fact that in 1527, Rome was sacked by the Holy Roman Empire, or soldiers of the Holy Roman Empire. So that sort of makes the Pope kind of a prisoner, if you will, of Henry or Charles V. Now, if he were to grant a annulment to Henry, what that does to Catherine is that sort of makes her marriage to him, it delegitimizes her marriage. It makes their firstborn child a bastard, Mary, even though she's a female. And then that makes, Catherine sort of a philanderer, if the marriage, because what the annulment states is, and typically the Catholic Church will grant an annulment if one of the spouses wants to get, or doesn't want to have children. Traditionally, the Catholic Church viewed marriage as acceptable only if both parties were interested in having children, because they viewed sex as a sin, and that the only way that sex was acceptable, even in a marriage, was if the family was trying to have children. So traditionally, that's sort of why Catholic families have always been so large. That doesn't exist anymore. I mean, that belief has changed. They do not believe that sin in marriage is sinful. Okay, but Catholic couples are not allowed to practice most forms of contraception. But that's neither here nor there. But so the other instance or reason why not to grant the divorce or the annulment was right here, okay? And so the argument that they used, that Cardinal Wolsey used to Pope Clement VII for why that Henry should be granted the annulment, is because the marriage was cursed, that he should have never been allowed to marry Catherine in the first place. Why? Well, what's the deal with that? Well, because actually, Henry was the second-born son of Henry VII. Henry's older brother, Arthur, was the heir to the throne. And so that arranged marriage was actually between Catherine and Arthur. And Arthur died soon after the marriage. And so because they didn't have a child together, the thought was, why not allow Henry, the next born son, marry Catherine? But in order for that to take place, they had to get what's called special dispensation from a previous pope, Pope Julius II, who granted it. Okay, so again, the argument is the marriage was cursed. If you look at all the deaths of her 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so she has more or less 5 of her 6 children die sometime around childbirth or before. And because they had to receive that special dispensation that was based on scriptures, Old Testament, Leviticus, it states very clearly that you're not supposed to have any sort of physical relationship with your brother's widow. So that creates a challenge, I guess. And so that was the argument, that they should have never been granted the permission to get married. But because popes um, are viewed to be infallible, incapable of making an error when it comes to issues of doctrine. If Pope Clement was to sort of grant that annulment, he would, based on their grounds, he would be sort of vetoing what Pope Julius had said previously, and that they can't do. It's very difficult to change the church. This creates all sorts of challenges, and we're going to see as the course goes on. But even if you look at modern day Catholicism, there is tremendous pressure by more, I guess, liberal or progressive Catholics to bring the church into the 20th or even 21st or maybe just even the 20th century. With issues such as the right of clergy members to get married, female priests, and the like. But those issues have already been sort of discussed and ruled upon, and it's very difficult for the church to make any changes. I think they would have to call into session some form of what do they call it, like a general council. I think the last time they had one was called Vatican II in 1964, if I'm not mistaken, and the church did bring about some changes, but nothing as drastic as that. At any rate, because Pope Clement refused the annulment, they kind of went to Plan B, and Plan B, which was hatched by these two gentlemen, Thomas Cranmer and Thomas Cromwell. They basically suggested that they create the highest religious or ecclesiastical court in England the ability to grant the annulment. And before the papacy or the church in Rome could somehow overrule that ruling, they would go ahead and break from the Church of England. Okay, so this is what happens. He's granted the annulment. He quickly marries Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn has a child, but to his disappointment, it's another girl, and this time it's Elizabeth. So to complete the break with the Church of England, Parliament passes the Act of Supremacy, and the significance of this is really the monarch becomes the head of the church instead of the Pope. The monarch, and in this case it's Henry VIII, but whoever is the sitting monarch, the head of state, will also be the head of the Church of England. Other than that, though, from a doctrinal standpoint, there are no changes. Okay, everything else remains the same. So in many instances, it's still a Catholic church. It just isn't Roman Catholic. It's English Catholic. They just don't acknowledge the Pope in Rome as the head of the church. So in order to gain support, there's a number of things that Henry does to make sure that there's not some sort of backlash against this. He passes, or has Parliament pass, the Treason Act, making it punishable by death anyone who refuses to acknowledge that he is the head of the Church of England. And one of his closest advisors and friends, Thomas More, who we've discussed previously, the author of Utopia, who is a very pious Catholic, refuses to take that oath of loyalty, and subsequently he is beheaded for that. So when we look theologically or doctrinally, from a dogmatic standpoint, as I said, the church retains most, if not all, of the Catholic practices. So confession, the adherence to the 7 sacraments, clerical celibacy, and even transubstantiation. Okay, the one area, and what that does, at least amongst the people, is it keeps some normalcy. What we'll learn in this course is that most people abhor change. Historically, from a historical standpoint, people don't like change. Anytime some movement ushers in significant change, there's often a backlash against that. And so Henry wisely kept everything theologically Catholic. And so at least amongst the citizenry, as they went into worship on Sunday, nothing really drastically changed. And so this was something that they could sort of support. The one area that there was a change is they booted out all of the mendicant orders. So, like, they got rid of all the monks, they got rid of the friars, the Dominicans, who had a bad reputation as it was. So this was not anything that upset anybody. So what he does with the seized monastic land was he sells it to those members of parliament, nobles primarily, who are willing to support his break. So that was very wise. He ends up having Anne Boleyn beheaded because it turns out he finds that she is having an affair on him. So that's not acceptable. His third wife, Jane Seymour, produces the long-awaited male heir, but then she dies soon after. He has let's see, a fourth wife. Her name is Anna Cleves. He divorces her because he's not physically attracted to her. The next one is Catherine Howard. She has an affair on him, and so he has her beheaded. So that's the second to be beheaded. And then his last wife, the lovely Catherine Parr, outlives him. Okay. So we want to take a look at his son, Edward VI, who ascends to the throne. Obviously, he's a boy. He's too young to govern as head of state on his own, so he has to have an advisor, which we call a regent. It's Archbishop Cranmer. And what ends up happening is the Church of England begins to move towards a more Protestant direction. They come in with a new liturgy. Okay, so the liturgy is how the church service is to be practiced. So they bring what's called the Book of Common Prayer. The Catholic Mass is centered around the Eucharist. The Protestant service is centered around the sermon, which is related to scriptures. So that's, in case you're wondering, that's what's happening. Beginning to de-emphasize the Eucharist and bring more prominence towards the sermon. Okay? This rapid change creates some opposition because there's still a lot of Catholics in England, and so there is a division. There is a religious divide between the Catholics and the Protestants. Queen Mary, when she comes to the throne in 1553, after Edward dies, she is a committed Catholic, and so she's committed to undoing the Church of England. She's going to reinstitute Catholicism. She attempts to do that. She's also married to Philip II, who is the King of Spain. So Philip II, wait a minute, Philip's King of Spain, wasn't Mary's mother, Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain? So what's the Wow. So if you look at this chart here, you can see this is a bit of a incestuous relationship, an incestuous marriage between Mary I and Philip. As it turns out, they're cousins. First cousins once removed, and the once removed just simply means they're not on the same generation line. She's actually one generation older. So that's the first cousin once removed. So if you have a first cousin and your first cousin has a child, that's your first cousin once removed. So that's what that means. They're not, whatever. It doesn't matter. It's gross, but she's married to him anyway. And so as part of her attempt to restore Catholicism, she has 280 of the leading Protestants burned at the stake. So she has taken a very traditional position in handling religious division. Okay, the fear at this time, the conventional wisdom in the 16th century is that religious division creates political division. So if you want political unity, then you have to have religious unity. And so this is the reason for the burning of the stake, burning at the stake. So she only lives a short time, and when her youngest or her younger sister, her half sister, so this is Anne Boleyn's daughter Elizabeth, comes to the throne, she's going to usher in a lot of changes. Not because of anything that she feels from a religious standpoint. Her first and most important goal is to maintain political unity within her country. So she doesn't want the religious division to tear the country apart, to force the country to devolve into a civil war or a religious war. So she's going to be very clever, and she's going to kind of forge her own path, her own way of dealing with this, and takes a very novel approach, and it proves to be very successful. So she gets credit for that. That's her ability to navigate the very complicated religious question in her country. She does so rather masterfully. She has a very long reign. We'll actually be discussing some of her political and foreign policy dealings in the next chapter. So for now, I mean, because she has nearly a 50-year reign, we're just going to focus on her positions within the Church of England. So we're going to get into a later video, and we're going to talk about John Calvin. And John Calvin, creates a form of Protestantism that's even more radical, if you will, or more different, more different than what Lutheranism is. Okay, so it's even a further break from Catholicism, and so that form of Protestantism comes to England by the name of Puritanism. Okay, and so what the Puritans, how they get their name, is they want to purify the Church of England. They want to purify it to eliminate any remaining forms of Catholicism that exist. Okay, so they're not just Lutherans, they're Calvinists. And so they're pretty at odds with Catholicism. They would probably look upon Catholicism as a cult. And so they're very vocal about that, and they want to get rid of anything. So that's what she has to deal with. She's dealing with two polar opposites, the Catholics and the Puritans. Okay, so this is a very difficult thing that she's going to do. So what she does is she creates a religion, not again because of anything that she believes. She purposely picks the middle path, like the halfway point between Puritanism and Catholicism. And so what that means is the Catholics are going to have to give up some things. The Calvinists or the Puritans are going to have to give up some things. But on the other side, the Catholics get certain things that that they'll recognize within the Mass, if you will, or the liturgy, and the Calvinists or the Puritans will get certain things that they like as well. And this religious moderation helps smother the religious differences that exist in England. And from this point forward, we're going to refer to the Church of England as the Anglican Church. She still, with the act, she has Parliament pass a new act of supremacy where she becomes the supreme governess of the Church of England. It's just a title change. It's not too much subsequence or substance there. All right. So the one thing that she allows for people is if they want to practice their faith, Puritanism and Catholicism on their own or in private, there's going to be some tolerance there. However, they do, under punishment of law, have to attend the Anglican worship services on Sunday. So if then after that they want to go and in private have a Catholic mass, they're free to do so. But the punishment isn't too severe. It's paying a fine. But that's just an attempt to try to make the church. So in a sense, everybody has to be the same religion. But if they choose to practice their own faith in private, no harm is going to come to them, no punishment. So this, that practice, the liturgy being, more Protestant, all of that's known as the Elizabethan settlement. Okay, and so that was the way that she was successful in preventing any form of religious division in her country. So that wraps up this video and this segment of Protestantism, or the Protestant Reformation. In the next video, we're going to be talking about John Calvin.